Can you turbocharge a naturally aspirated Mercedes diesel? This is one of my favorite topics, partially because the Mercedes turbo diesel engine and their concept of how to build a proper turbo diesel engine is so fascinating. But then at the same time, because the Mercedes turbo diesels are internally so different from the naturally aspirated diesels that you're really talking about two different engines. And yes, I said that properly. So if you look at the non-turbo version of an OM 617, which would be like a 617 910 or 912, versus the turbo diesel engine, which would be an OM 617.95, you are in essence talking about two different engines. And so when you look at the principal Mercedes diesels that I deal with, which are the 220D, which has an OM 615, the 240D, which has an OM 616, and the 300D, which has the OM 617, and then you look at the turbo diesels that I deal with, which are exclusively OM 617 engines, you could see that there is not really... The engines are similar in how they look and run and sound and the injection pumps and this and that. But when you start looking at the details of how the engines were built, they're two different engines. They might use the same oil filter. They might use the same valve cover. They might use the same external injector design, the same type of front crankshaft seal, but when you look at items like the rod bearings, the crankshaft, the oil pump, the connecting rods, the pistons, the piston designs, the size of the valves, the thickness of the cylinder heads, actually that's the same, but the size of the exhaust valves, the cooling passages in the cylinder heads, all of that stuff is drastically different from an OM 617 non-turbo to an OM 617 turbo. So we're going to explore some of the key reasons why these engines are so different. And in the process, we'll explain why you can't just slap a turbo on a 220D or a 240D without expecting some pretty devastating results. So at the beginning of this whole thing, there was this idea that if you turbocharged a diesel engine, you would inevitably create more heat and more pressure, and the oil would have to do more work. So Mercedes knew they had to increase the oil supply and oil cooling and oil pump volume. But what they didn't fully understand is how much the pistons would expand when they're boosted. That means when you insert more air into a combustion chamber and that air is hot and it's exploding, that air pushes down on the piston, and if that piston gets hot enough, it starts to expand because air is not compressible from like a volume of like 100 cubic feet to 1 cubic foot. It's going to destroy the walls around it if you're trying to compress it that much unless they're really strong. And you can make the pistons really strong, but then they're too heavy. So the thing is, you have to dissipate some of the heat. If you could keep the temperatures down, then the piston won't fail. So Mercedes solved this problem by increasing the size, volume, and output, the size, output, and pressure of the oil pump, and by putting galleries in the bottoms of the pistons where oil would spray up from the main oil supply tube that was cast into the block right into the bottom of the piston. And it would spray constantly, and it would spray relentlessly, and it would fill up this gallery. And as it would go in, it would just drain out back into the pan. Now, this sounds kind of inefficient. They didn't have like a pressurized oil cooling system for the pistons. But the fastest way to get the heat out of the piston is to jet it with oil. And that hot oil really hot oil is going to literally take the heat and instantaneously transfer it back into the oil pan, where it's going to get sucked up, pushed into the filter, pushed through the cooler, brought through the cooler, and this is why the oil cooler is so important on a turbo diesel, then squirted into the piston so it can super cool them. Now, the cooling properties of oil are actually superior to that of coolant. You're not going to spray a piston inside an engine with coolant. Oil can cool things and keep them tempered in the most amazing way possible because it's so thick, its molecular density is so high that it has the ability to grab a large amount of heat and transfer it really fast. And that leads me to a second principle about the OM617 turbo diesel. The bottom end of that engine isn't water cooled. The reason those engines run so much cooler than the non-turbo versions, yeah, you heard me right, the turbo diesels actually do run cooler, is because they have such a big oil volume, it's moving through the engine so fast, they're oil cooled. Everything in that engine that really works, the pistons, the crank, the rods, the turbo itself, oil cooled. And the thing that's scrubbing heat is air. You have this little tiny oil cooler compared to the radiator. How does it work so efficiently? It works so efficiently because, first of all, oil doesn't get up to temperature and boil. It doesn't have the wide temperature fluctuations like antifreeze does. Second of all, oil starts off colder and thicker than antifreeze, so there's a lot of ability to expand and move and run through when it gets hot. It also permeates extremely well. And because it gets to these small surfaces, not only does it provide lubrication, but it acts as sort of a heat sink. It scrubs heat from moving parts really fast. And that's why I say you change your oil every 3,000 miles, because it will oxidize. Too much oxygen will get in the oil and it will use its lose its heat absorption and heat scrubbing ability. So because the OM616, 615, and non-turbo 617 don't have the piston coolers because they have a small oil pump, because they don't have the giant oil galleries, because they don't have the oil volume, output, circulation, return, and regurgitation that the turbo diesel does, they can't scrub the heat out of the pistons fast enough, and inevitably the pistons will expand and expand until they either break rings or themselves fracture, causing compression loss, or they'll just wear out. They'll keep expanding, contracting, and they'll eat up the bore in the cylinder. Now, this process takes 500,000 to 700,000 miles in a turbo diesel that has average or slightly below average maintenance. In a non-turbo, it'll be gone in 100,000 miles because it'll occur in 100,000 miles because the pistons are made of different materials. They're not designed to be this ultra high density, super tough aluminum. And you could see the difference if you start weighing the parts. Like the non-turbo 5-cylinder engines use a connecting rod that dates all the way back to the OM615 engine in 1968. Now these parts were revised and they got 616 numbers, but then, and they were updated and improved as time went on. But let's say you take a rod from a turbo diesel engine, you look at it, and then remember the connecting rod is pushing the piston up against turbo boost and a greater injection volume. It's not designed to, it's designed to withstand much more heat and stress than a non-turbo rod. Non-turbo rod can't withstand the heat and stress. The turbo rod is so much thicker, so much stronger. It's made of a higher grade steel than the non-turbo connecting rod. So think about this for a second. If you try to boost a non-turbo diesel engine, eventually what's going to happen to that rod? I mean, these things threw rods even with no problems with boost. So many of these non-turbo engines died by throwing rods. So few turbo diesel engines designed by throwing rods, unless you were an idiot and abused your car. What does that tell you? It tells you that the non-turbo rods are just not designed for it. We've had a number of engines and they go in for rebuilds. My machinist will look at the rods and he'll say, I measured this thing, it's not going to last another 50,000 miles. It's not going to last another 10,000 miles. When you start putting stress on this thing because it's been heated up and starved for oil, it's going to go bang. It's going to eject itself out the side of the block. Connecting rod failure is the number one mechanical failure in a poorly maintained turbo diesel engine. On a non-maintained Mercedes diesel engine. On a turbo diesel engine, the rods have to handle so much stress and so much force that they're essentially just, going to get pulled apart if they're subjected to, twice or three times the stress. Anyway, I hope you found this informative. This is why non-turbo diesel engines should be made to turbo diesel engines. If you like this video, please subscribe, tap the bell for notifications, and thank you for supporting us on Patreon. And if you really enjoy this video, please give it a like and tell your friends about this channel. See you in the future.